Well, good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of Executive Intelligence Review, I'd like to welcome you to this third of 3 post-election broadcasts that we have decided to organize here in Washington. I say broadcast because at the same time that we are gathered here, today's proceedings are being broadcast live via the internet. They are being listened to in capitals all over the world. There is a group gathered in New York City at the United Nations that will be participating in the discussion with us. And I'd certainly like to welcome all of you here. Today's seminar obviously takes place as the 107th Congress of the United States is being sworn in. It takes place several days before President-elect George W. Bush is to be certified by the United States Congress. As we gather today, a call to Congress, which was first issued by Mr. LaRouche at the last seminar we hosted, calling for a congressional review of the manner in which America conducts its elections, including the manner in which the primary elections, where Mr. LaRouche was a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, was conducted, was issued. In the 2 weeks following that seminar, several hundred prominent Americans, most of them elected officials, joined Mr. LaRouche in that call to Congress. And as the 107th Congress takes its seat today, that call will be one of the first orders of business on their desk. Certainly in the days since the U.S. presidential election occurred, we have seen a series of dramatic, although not unanticipated events on the global financial markets, and there is little question that as we begin our proceedings today, the world is careening toward the worst financial crisis, certainly in the history of this nation and possibly in modern history. It is a very timely moment for Lyndon LaRouche to be addressing an international audience, not only because of Mr. LaRouche's role as a presidential candidate, but most especially because he is recognized without question as the most prominent physical economist alive in the world today. Also, since our last webcast, because of the terrible vacuum of leadership in the Democratic Party, Mr. LaRouche has also announced his intention to seek the Democratic presidential nomination in the year 2004. Without further ado, I'd like to take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to present to you Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Lynn?
Well, obviously, in talking about 2004, my immediate concern is not what's going to happen in the year 2004. My concern is what's going to happen now and whether we shall ever get to 2004 as a nation or not. There's presently a meeting, I understand, occurring in Austin, Texas, among the party reporting to the president-elect or putative president-elect down there. The problem today is that from everything you can see about what this team, not only Mr. Bush, but the entire team, his team, has said about policy, that the incoming president promises to be the greatest catastrophe in American presidential history, not some years down the line, but in the next weeks and months immediately ahead. The problem, which I shall outline today, and also indicate what my role in this business is that we are not only in the worst financial crisis in modern history, the biggest one, we're also in globally a potential global economic breakdown crisis. That is something qualitatively worse than a depression. if the Bush team occupies the presidency and sticks to the policies which it has stated it is firmly committed to, the United States will very soon be destroyed as a nation. Not years down the line, but perhaps in a very short period of time. Why? What you've seen recently is the collapse of one of the greatest financial swindles in modern history. It was called the Y2K swindle. Now, knowing about 1996, what they planned to do, Wall Street, typified by our dear friend Greenspan, who is about to go down like the famous Rumpelstiltskin, who disappeared, and Greenspan is going to be doubling for Rumpelstiltskin when he goes down some hole someplace and disappears, which will be fairly soon, because his end is nigh. Not his mortal end, but at least his identity as a leading figure of the United States. What happened with Y2K was that the United States government, in collaboration with Wall Street, created one of the biggest swindles in world history. The swindle was based on the argument that come the year January 1st, 2000, the danger would be that the world's computers, which are operating on the basis of a final two-digit symbol for date, year date, would crash when 99 became 00. And that this was the thing that could blow out the entire system. So what happened over these years was a vast amount of money was poured in on the basis of the panic of fear of a Y2K blowout. It was poured into software rewriting, it was poured into financing new computer systems which otherwise would not have been bought at the way they were. It was also to create a vast pool of money, of financial power, ready to stand ready on January 1st, 2000, to assure that the system didn't go belly up when the computers failed to report the accounting figures for January 1st, 2000 on. Now, of course, that never happened. There never was any danger of that. The problem was being fixed in the meantime. But what happened is that through this swindle called the Y2K swindle, they built up a fake industry using the image of so-called new economy and internet-related industries to build up a vast bubble where you saw people who were worth nothing becoming billionaires based on stock appreciation. And now they've gone back to being non-billionaires because their stock went back towards zero. And they're out in the street saying, I was a billionaire. And they look like a bum, and they were a bum beforehand. But these things have collapsed. The dot-com crisis. We've seen the internet collapse, the NASDAQ stock collapse around the world. What they did is they fought like the devil throughout the year 2000 to try to keep this so-called new economy or Y2K bubble alive. They were determined to keep it alive until after the November 7th general presidential elections, which is what they did. But the election came, and it was a bummer. Nobody was really elected, so the Supreme Court got in and decided who was elected when nobody really knew. We still don't know. So at that point, the system, for various reasons, crashed. And the will to keep the system going also crashed. Now, why? Well, in the meantime, what had happened to the U.S. economy was something similar to what happened to Germany in the year 1923. Now, some people who are old enough to recall or read about it, that when the French troops occupied the Rhineland after World War I, in order to collect the so-called war reparations debt, the German government got the French troops out of Germany by promising to pay this reparations debt, which they tried to do by printing money, Reichsmarks. This went on until the year 1923, where they were still printing Reichsmarks, German press. The spring and summer, a change occurred. The amount of money that was spent to roll over the war reparations debt by the German banking system in printing money was greater than the amount of the total debt. At that point, the inflation in currency exploded as price inflation in commodities. And you had the famous German hyperinflation of July through November 1923, at which the German Reichsmark disappeared. It vanished. It exploded. Now, during the year 2000, we came to a similar point, in which the vast amounts of money which Greenspan and company were printing in various ways to pump up the U.S. markets had reached the point that the amount of money being poured in to subsidize the U.S. debt, accumulated debt, was greater than the debt it was trying to roll over. And you began to see, in the course of the year 2000, you began to see a commodity price inflation of a type similar to what happened in Germany in 1923. You saw it in petroleum prices. You're seeing it now in the California energy crisis of South California Edison and PGE. You're going to see it all over the country. You're going to see a blowout of entire systems of utility systems, electrical utility systems and others as a result of this. You already are seeing a hyperinflationary, inflationary process in home acquisition. That is, in some areas of the country, it's cost 200 or 300% as much as a few years ago simply to find a place in which to put your family. You're seeing a rise in price in the order of magnitude of 20, 30% and more of price inflation in the commodities which people buy, as manufacturers buy to produce products. So you're seeing a general tendency toward commodity price inflation of the same type in general that you saw in Germany in 1923. Now that began to hit strong over the summer of this past year and into the fall. The figures are there. There is despite the lies from Wall Street, despite the lies from the government, there is a hyperinflationary tendency in commodity prices in major categories inside the United States today. Now, obviously, the attempt to keep pumping the system up the way they'd pumped up the Y2K bubble before was no longer tolerable. November 7th had come, the election was over. They didn't want to have a financial crisis before the presidential election. So they kept the system floating until then, and then they began to back off. You now have an impossible situation. If Alan Greenspan, the idiot, for example, and I say idiot because people are calling him a genius. He's not a genius. He's an idiot. He's a fool operating according to script. And he's going to be disappearing very soon because he's going to come to the point very soon, with this depression running on fast, people are going to start demanding that he drop interest rates. They're going to demand that he inflate the economy still further after he's already hyperinflated it. And Alan Greenspan is just going to find himself in a position where he wants to disappear. And like the famous Rumpelstiltskin of the fairy story, he's going to stamp his feet in the ground one day and just plain disappear for his own good. This thing is finished, it's over. Now, on top of that, we have another crisis, which is a global crisis. When I talk about a breakdown crisis, I'm not exaggerating. Over the past period, the United States, which ceased to become a major exporter, beginning with the Carter administration. Remember, Carter shut down infrastructure, he shut down the savings and loan banks, and similar kinds of things. He destroyed the kind of industry that is the small high-tech industries on which productivity depends. Began to gut the farmers, gut the small producers, the small entrepreneurs, who were the gut of productivity and growth in an economy, not the big corporations. The big corporations sometimes used to produce a decent product, but they were able to produce a decent product because they relied upon vendors, largely in the machine tool category, who produced a high-quality technology product, which you saw reflected in automobiles and other products. These people were put out of business by Carter and by Volcker and by what followed during the early 1980s. So the United States went from a position of being formerly the most successful economy in the world over the period from Roosevelt's recovery from 1933 to 1945 and into 1965. Despite all our mistakes, and we made a lot of them, we were still the model economy of the world in 1965. We began to destroy that when Nixon started to revive racism in America with his Southern Strategy campaign in 1966. And Carter took over and continued the racist Southern strategy when he became president during the late 1970s. Under these conditions, the traditional policies under which the United States had become the world's model success were torn down step by step. Whole sections of industry, small businesses, farms, so forth, were destroyed. Infrastructure was gutted, as you see in the shortage of electricity today. The economy was destroyed. What happened is over the course of the 1980s, especially beginning 1989, 1990, the United States became a net importer. We used to be the high-tech export leader of the world. We have become an importer. Worse, we have become the importer of last resort for the world. In Mexico, other parts of South America, in Asia, Japan, Korea, China, Southeast Asia, we are the importer of last resort. We are running a current account deficit recently estimated at about $600 billion a year. Current account deficit. A large part of that is simply our import-export deficit. We are importing most of our goods from the world, especially from the areas where cheap labor is abundant. China and so forth. From the yen carry trade area, from the euro carry trade area. We have been importing, and we've been going into hock to do it. But the world has depended upon the United States, as China, Japan, Korea, others have, to continue to buy our products from them to keep their economies alive. Now we've reached the point with this crisis that that's not going to happen anymore. You're going to see a tragedy is going to occur in Mexico. Mexico will be the country the worst hit by this. There will be a collapse in the maquiladoras and other export industry, and Mexico has become highly U.S. export dependent for our imports. You're going to see it in Asia, hard crashes throughout Asia. You're going to see a hard crash in a whole section of the economy of China as a result of this process, because the United States can no longer afford to finance this flood of imports from cheap labor markets in other parts of the world, which means that those parts of the world which have been counting on selling into the U.S. market are going to face tremendous cutbacks in their export levels. Cutbacks which will throw them into a bankruptcy, a deficit position. This means that the collapse of the U.S. market as an importer of last resort for the world is going to set a chain reaction of collapse loose around the world as a whole. Now, how do we maintain this position? We maintain the position because of the speculative bubble, that foreigners who had money in the United States or had money they could invest in the United States could get a high yield on short-term by investing in these short-term markets such as the internet market. Therefore, they kept their money parked into the United States and moving into the United States, thus pumping up the U.S. financial bubble. The fictitious profits generated by this speculation inside the United States was keeping the United States going. And as long as this bubble continued, the United States thought it could continue to support this level of imports as the importer of last resort. Other nations of the world continued this policy and supported the United States, not because they liked what we're doing, but because they wanted to export their products to us. We were the importer of last resort. Other nations, the Euro bloc, the Euro carry trade bloc, the yen carry trade bloc, others, supported the United States for fear that if they didn't, their exports would collapse because the U.S., as the importer of last resort, would collapse. What's happened now is since the collapse which has occurred at the year end, and now is occurring this week, because of this collapse, this means that that game has come to a screeching halt. We can expect major percentile collapses immediately in the U.S. economy. The fact that Bush plans an arms spending binge of at least modest proportions through Donald Rumsfeld, his designated Secretary of Defense, does not mean that arms spending or arms expenditures are going to bail the U.S. economy out. They're not going to. Then the chain reaction effect of the United States no longer being the importer of last resort is going to have a chain reaction effect on other parts of the world. South America, Central America, Africa is already suffering. Europe, Asia are all going to collapse. This collapse of these parts of the world economy is going to again come back and hit the United States in a new wave. This is all coming on fast. Now, technically, we are bankrupt as a nation. The entire banking system of the United States as a collective unit is bankrupt. The Federal Reserve System is bankrupt. The European central banking systems are bankrupt. The central banking systems, or the equivalent of Central and South America, are bankrupt. Africa is totally bankrupt. The Middle East is on the edge of a potential war which can become a religious war spreading throughout the Muslim and other parts of the world. There are explosions potentially in South Asia, crises of these types. There's a crisis in Europe. Europe is bankrupt. England is bankrupt. Continental Europe, Western Europe depends upon the German economy, and the German economy is operating at a loss under these conditions. They've destroyed their export market, though they're thinking of getting another one. These are the conditions that we face. Now, what's George Bush going to do about it? What can he do about it with that team he's got? What can he do about it with the number of Democrats on the Democratic side of the aisle who think like Bush, or the Gore people, who you had trouble finding the difference between a Gore supporter and a Bush supporter when it came to policy? That's the problem we face now. What are we going to do about it? Well, it's obvious. This didn't start yesterday. We didn't get into this mess yesterday. From 1933 to 1965, the U.S. was rebuilt from a depression caused by the policies of Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Calvin Coolidge, was saved by Roosevelt, who understood the nature of the problem. Roosevelt carried the United States through the Depression without setting up any kind of dictatorship which would upset our Constitution. Roosevelt got us through World War II, and the programs of Roosevelt, even though they were chopped down after his death, nonetheless continued to support the United States and Western Europe in recovery from the wartime and Depression conditions. So that over the period 1933 to 1965, despite all the mistakes we made, we were the model economy of the world. So that if we take away all the bad things we did between 1933 and 65, there were lots of them, we still were, in net effect, a nation dedicated to improvement. The general improvement of the conditions of life, improvement in productivity, improvement in quality of product, all of these things together. If we look back then, what we did between 1933 and 1965, in net effect, was successful. We were still a successful economy despite all our mistakes. Since 1965, since Nixon started with his pro-racist Southern strategy and his wild free trade policies, the United States has been going downhill. Take the points. We collapsed in 1971 with the drop into a floating exchange rate world monetary system. That was the first catastrophe. As a result of Henry Kissinger's similar efforts in the causing a Middle East war and some other crises, we were in worse condition by 1975. In 1976, the Southern strategy took over the Democratic Party. The same racists that were policies behind Nixon took over Carter. Carter did more damage to the U.S. economy in his one term in office than all other presidents combined since 1965. He deregulated, he destroyed infrastructure, and he unleashed what he called, or what his administration called, controlled disintegration of the U.S. economy. And the U.S. economy has disintegrated. 1982, under Bush-Reagan, we had Garn St. Germain, which picked the bones of the banking system that Carter had bankrupted. We had Kemp Roth, which told Wall Street to steal, not to invest in real industry. We had junk bonds, a form of theft, a form of swindle. We had derivatives, which took off in the 1990s, but were already there in the 1980s. Then in 1989, 1990, Margaret Thatcher, George Bush, and Francois Mitterrand pulled a bigger swindle on the wake of the process of disintegration of the Soviet system and moved to set up a world empire based on financial speculation, not production, and to eliminate the powers of the sovereign nation state in the United States as well as every other nation. It was called globalization. It's a return to the Roman Empire and to the slavery that implies. So over this period, the period from 1966 to the present time, the United States, which was once the world's leading economy, is now become one of the worst, but the biggest failure among economies. We are now at the point the whole shebang is about to collapse. Now, what's the problem? The problem is not only George Bush, because I don't think George Bush knows anything or could understand anything of this stuff, but he's got a bunch of people around him who do have some intelligence, and they do understand some things. But they, as a machine, are committed to the policies which were built up step by step under Nixon with the Southern Strategy, under Kissinger, under Carter, under Brzezinski, under George Bush as vice president and president, and so on, down to the present time. So the Republican Party in the majority, and a good deal of the Democratic Party as well at the top, is the party of the great mistake. 35 years of a bad mistake. These are parties which in their present policies are committed to making their mistakes bigger and better. More mistake. George Bush is committed to defending the great mistake of the past 35 years and making it bigger and better. Gore was committed to continuing the bad mistake of the past 35 years, making it bigger and better. He and Newt Gingrich and Al Toffler, back during Carter days in Georgia, were working together to push off this third wave thing, which is part of this present insanity. So the problem is not that we don't have solutions. We do have solutions. We could go back to things that worked. We could agree with other nations because there's a depression. We could agree to convene a new international monetary conference to establish again the kind of fixed exchange rate system that got us out of the depression in the post-war period. Establish capital controls, exchange controls, regulation, reinstall regulation of our industries, such as the power industry, which is now in a crisis, to make sure we get power regulated, to restore our health care system, to restore our educational system. We did these things before under depression and depression-like conditions, and we can do them again. Other nations would agree with us. So why do we do it? There are solutions. Yes, the crisis is much bigger than Roosevelt faced, but the lessons we learned from the success of Roosevelt and his legacy shows us how we should approach these problems today. Now then ask yourself, where do people stand on the question of Roosevelt versus Coolidge? Where do they stand on Kennedy versus Nixon? Where do they stand in the parties? Do they propose the policies of Coolidge, the policies of Bush, the policies of Nixon, or do they propose the policies of Roosevelt and Kennedy? Which?
Well, good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of Executive Intelligence Review, I'd like to welcome you to this third of 3 post-election broadcast that we have decided to organize here in Washington. I say broadcast because at the same time that we are gathered here, today's proceedings are being broadcast live via the internet. They are being listened to in capitals all over the world. There is a group gathered in New York City at the United Nations that will be participating in the discussion with us. And I'd certainly like to welcome all of you here. Today's seminar obviously takes place as the 107th Congress of the United States is being sworn in. It takes place several days before President-elect George W. Bush is to seek the Democratic presidential nomination in the year 2004. Without further ado, I'd like to take this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to present to you Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Lynn?
Well, obviously, in talking about 2004, my immediate concern is not what's going to happen in the year 2004. My concern is what's going to happen now and whether we shall ever get to 2004 as a nation or not. There's presently a meeting, I understand, occurring in Austin, Texas, among the party reporting to the president-elect or putative president-elect down there. The problem today is that from everything you can see about what this team, not only Mr. Bush,
to be certified by the United States Congress. As we gather today, a call to Congress, which was first issued by Mr. LaRouche at the last seminar we hosted, calling for a congressional review of the manner in which America conducts its elections, including the manner in which the primary elections, where Mr. LaRouche was a candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, was conducted, was issued. In the 2 weeks following that seminar, several hundred prominent Americans, most of them elected officials, joined Mr. LaRouche in that call to Congress. And as the 107th Congress takes its seat today, that call will be one of the first orders of business on their desk. Certainly in the days since the U.S. presidential election occurred, we have seen a series of dramatic, although not unanticipated events on the global financial markets, and there is little question that as we begin our proceedings today, the world is careening toward the worst financial crisis, certainly in the history of this nation and possibly in modern history. It is a very timely moment for Lyndon LaRouche to be addressing an international audience, not only because of Mr. LaRouche's role as a presidential candidate, but most especially because he is recognized without question as the most prominent physical economist alive in the world today. Also, since our last webcast, because of the terrible vacuum of leadership in the Democratic Party, Mr. LaRouche has also announced his intention.
Bush, but the entire team, his team, has said about policy that the incoming president promises to be the greatest catastrophe in American presidential history, not some years down the line, but in the next weeks and months immediately ahead. The problem is, which I shall outline today, and also indicate what my role in this business is that we are not only in the worst financial crisis in modern history, the biggest one, we're also in globally a potential global economic breakdown crisis that is something qualitatively worse than a depression. If the Bush team occupies the presidency and sticks to the policies which it has stated it is firmly committed to, the United States will